Old Sparky?
Old Smoky?
Gruesome Gertie?
The Yellow Mama? We're calling this one truly shocking. Hello again, everyone, and welcome to Well-Hung History, where we tell true tales of the condemned and the executed. We'll also talk a little bit about the various methods and devices of execution that have been deployed throughout time. I'm your host, Terry Allen, and thanks for joining us. We're calling this one truly shocking, and it will focus solely on the electric chair. We will turn our attention to its unlikely origins, its use, its effectiveness or lack thereof, and its legacy. So kick back and relax as we tell the tale of this gruesome device. The origin story goes like this. The idea and the development of execution by electrocution is credited, if you can call it that, to, of all things, a dentist in Buffalo, New York, named Alfred Southwick. This sort of came to germination during the later decades of the 19th century. It's a very unusual story, and we're going to get into it just a little bit here. He had learned of a man in the area that had haphazardly and drunkenly stumbled into an electric generator, it seems, and was electrocuted and died instantaneously and painlessly. This appears to have been witnessed by several passersby and was widely reported in the local press. Southwick became fascinated by this, and he began to investigate this process as a way to perfect the typical form of capital punishment that would have been most prominent at the time in the United States, and that would have been hanging. Alfred Southwick was of Quaker extraction, and his religious faith most likely encouraged him to seek a quicker and less painful method of execution that had come before. So as we've discussed on other episodes in this podcast, which have focused on things like the guillotine and other sort of very dramatic and barbaric forms of execution, we have to consider this manner of thinking, not in the context of today, but in the historical context of the time, and how the idea of capital punishment would have been perceived and the changing attitudes as to its practice as time has gone on. A man like Southwick probably considered himself a reformer or even a progressive of his day, and he was trying to employ modern technology to hasten the suffering of the condemned person. So throughout the 1880s, he experiments with this process on stray animals in an attempt to perfect this process for use eventually on human beings. We reference you to our episode on the guillotine as it relates to the idea of capital punishment as something vicious and something primitive. But there were all sorts of reformers where there was no real appetite for anti-capital punishment movements in most of the Western world, or really anywhere in the world, definitely not in the United States at this time. So people were trying to find a more humane way rather than advocating for the end of the death penalty. They were trying to find a way to make the gruesome process more humane. In the United States, a commission is formed to investigate this idea of electrocution as a replacement to hanging, which was falling out of favor in much of the country. So Southwick writes several articles. He proposes this newfound method, and due to his training and practice as a dentist, he suggests that the condemned be confined to a chair. A chair? That's kind of a new idea. Thus, the electric chair. Get it? It's not that hard to imagine that this commission at this era, again, we're talking 1880s, that was convened to investigate this further was very divided in their opinions. The old stalwarts resorted to their faith in hanging. There were the rare abolitionists. And there were a sizable number who expressed support for Southwick's proposition. Now, after endless discussion and disputation, etc., eventually Southwick's, quote, electric chair model is actually adopted by the commission. And 3 of these devices are ordered and approved to be sent to the most secure prisons in New York at that time, by the way, all of which still exist today. And those were Sing Sing, Auburn, and Clinton, which is also known today as Dannemora. After the resolution is passed certifying electrocution as the official method of execution in the state of New York, a notable conflict arises as to the actual science of the device. And this gets very tricky. This gets very complicated. So in other words, they were debating, and we're talking about scientists, we're talking about prison officials. So there's various voices that are weighing in here. And the question really comes down to how many volts of electricity, where exactly the body should the electrodes be applied, etc. So many of the experts of all sorts are consulted, and most notably, Thomas Edison himself and George Westinghouse. These were the most prominent experts of their time, at least in the United States, on this subject. And they go back and forth after many experiments are performed on all sorts of animals, including cows and horses. These 2 prominent scientists each argued that their cherished and patented methods of electrical current, that being DC, direct current, that was Thomas Edison, and AC, alternating current, that was George Westinghouse. Now, this is not a drunken argument about who is or who was the better AC/DC singer, Bon Scott or Brian Johnson. This was a real battle between the 2 preeminent scientists of their era as to which method was more effective to exterminate an individual. Ultimately, 1,500 volts of electricity were considered to be the proper usage, and the various technologies devised by these squabbling scientists, Edison and Westinghouse, were actually both employed. Finally, a man named Edwin Davis was appointed, and I love this, by the way. I loved the name of his title. His title was the State Electrician, a.k.a. the Executioner. All right. And he actually added the finishing touches, and he went on to oversee, in his career, what a career, 240 executions in a 25-year period, including the first, which we're about to learn about next. So now it's time to talk about the actual usage of the electric chair. And the man with the ignominious fate to first sit in the not-so-comfy chair was a certain William Kemmler, who was led there in 1890. He had been convicted of murdering his wife with a hatchet. And as we all know, as was the custom of the time, when the old lady fixes you a supper and you don't like it, you go to the barn, you fetch a hatchet, and you kill her with a hatchet. And that's what it appears that Mr. Kemmler did. His defense as the first guinea pig was predictable, that this method of execution was cruel and unusual punishment, as famously cited in the U.S. Constitution, and used then, as it is now, and forever, as a logical defense. But his plea was rejected. Though I think we can all agree that his defense was half right. Whether it was cruel or not remained to be seen, but it certainly was unusual, as it was the first such execution of its kind of a human being in known history. So on August 6th, 1890, the experiment that was no longer an experiment, that was now an actual execution, proceeds. And it's a massive understatement to say that this would-be humane perfection of execution was anything of the sort. Strapped to the wooden chair, the hood affixed to his head, arms and legs were tied firmly, and electrodes were strapped to various parts of his body, and 1,000 watts of AC was sent through him. He was reported to have shaken violently for 17 seconds before going unconscious. Well, so far, so good, we guess, as opposed to hanging. But it doesn't end there. When approached by the attending physicians, Kemmler's heart was pounding and he was still breathing. And one of the physicians cried out, quote, "Have the current turned on again. Do it quick with no delay," which sounds to me like some sort of Frankenstein movie. But that's what was actually recorded at the time. So despite his pleas, it took some more time to restore the current, and eventually twice the dose, 2,000 volts now, were applied, which took an estimated 8 minutes to ultimately kill him. Now, the scene here is a ghastly one. What is known is that of what the witnesses told, all of whom were proponents of execution, or maybe just run-of-the-mill sadists, but they were horrified. The condemned man bled from his eyes and other parts of his body, and his skin was singed around the areas where the electrodes were applied, and he essentially caught fire in this very small death chamber, which caused such a stench that the witnesses fled for the exits. Was this the antidote to the former ways of execution that had gone on from time immemorial? Well, the New York Times didn't think so, and in an article reporting on this gruesome spectacle, they called it, quote, "far worse than hanging." Even George Westinghouse himself, who was party to this, commented that, quote, "they would have done far better by using an axe." So one might assume that this experiment on Mr. Kemmler would have been a one-off. But after a short break, we'll learn that nothing could have been further from the truth. After this first controversial electrocution, what happens conversely is that within a few years, other states begin to adopt electrocution as their official forms of capital punishment. And this happens in quite rapid succession. Ohio comes next, and then Massachusetts, New Jersey, and Virginia, and eventually more than half of the other United States and the federal government, including the U.S. military, would follow suit. Curiously, the Philippines is the only other country to utilize this form of execution, which it did quite enthusiastically for roughly 50 years, from 1926 until the 1970s. No doubt the influence and temporary occupation of that country by the U.S. government was the reason for this. In fact, over the next century after its first deployment in 1890, as we've learned, it would claim the lives of almost 5,000 people. And next to hanging, it has been the preferred method of execution in the United States since its founding. It remains nominally in existence in certain states even today, which we will be discussing shortly. And it may surprise you that a man as recently as 2020 was electrocuted in Tennessee. So let's discuss a few of the more notorious other people who have met their end in the electric chair. We've spoken in some depth about the first person to meet this fate, and now we'll cover quite arbitrarily some others that have been killed by this method. We'll talk about the first woman electrocuted, the youngest known person to go to the chair, and a few others that are notorious for their crimes and punishment. This is admittedly a short list, but hopefully will pique the interest to those out there in the audience that would like to learn more about this controversial topic. Some mention here will be covered in more depth on this podcast as it develops. So we hope you'll continually check back and as we discuss further those that have checked out. And so to that end, we'll cover not only the notorious, but also the lesser known, those that have been posthumously proven innocent, those that actually asked to receive this punishment, and we'll even go into more length about last statements and even last meals. Spoiler alert there's lots of hamburgers, pork chops, mashed potatoes, and there's lots of Dr. Pepper. Let's talk about some of the more notorious people that have been put to death via electrocution. And also, I want us all to think about the fact that this is a almost uniquely American way of execution, and it's also very particular with some of the exceptions that we've talked about and we'll mention at the end pretty much a 20th century American method of execution. We're now going to talk about some notorious cases, and it's a bit of a wide swath of people that we'll talk about. So we'll talk about some of the most notorious cases of those that have been executed via electrocution. More high-profile cases, people like the Rosenbergs, who were executed in the 1950s. We will be talking about other notorious criminals that were so widely publicized that we're going to dedicate whole podcasts to their cases. But now we're going to focus on some of the anomalies, some of the more unusual and hopefully interesting cases of people that died by this method. We're going to start with a woman named Martha Place. Her maiden name was Gerritsen. She was the first woman that was electrocuted. And it took place in Sing Sing prison in 1899. So 9 years after the first electrocution. So we'll go briefly into her life. She was considered mentally unstable after suffering a serious head injury in her younger years. And after a failed marriage, she found work as a housekeeper for a man in Brooklyn named William Place. Within a year, she married William, who was a much older man. Place was a divorcee who had a daughter named Ida. And it was known that Martha was very jealous of her, and the two sparred frequently. So things are not going well in the Place household, and William had called the cops, accusing his new bride of threatening to kill him. Old Bill must have been some sort of a clairvoyant, because Martha again tries murder, February 7th, 1898, and she attacks him with an axe. Here comes the axe again, paging Lizzie Borden. Axes. What is up with axes at this time? Bill is injured, but he manages to escape, and he alerts the cops. And when they arrive at the residence, they find Martha alive, also gravely injured, lying on the floor, and they also find gas burners that are turned on and flooding the home with toxic fumes. More shockingly, they discover the body of 17-year-old Ida upstairs, and she's dead from asphyxiation due to the gas. A later autopsy revealed she also had acid cast into her eyes, no doubt from the lovely and charming Martha. Martha was resuscitated and eventually led off to an asylum to await her inevitable fate. Though she pleads innocent, William testifies against her, and the outcome is a foregone conclusion. She is sentenced to death. Now, Teddy Roosevelt is the governor of New York at this time, and he refuses to commute the sentence, and so she would become the eternal footnote in the annals of execution of the first American woman to die in the electric chair. The next on this list is Father Hans Schmidt. Anybody out there know who Father Hans Schmidt was? I didn't until we started researching this topic. So this is a ghoulish story, and it ends in a very uncomfortable chair. So here we go. This was one nasty bad daddy. Can we just say that? He was and remains the only member of the Catholic clergy that was killed by electrocution. Little bio here. He was born in Germany in 1881. He had a long resume considering his relatively short life. And that resume consisted of many things: priest, rapist, murderer, suspected serial killer. Oh yeah, and he also liked to drink human blood. He seems to be a sort of self-ordained priest in his native Germany, and he buggers altar boys, and he also maintains affairs with numerous women as well. Inevitably, he appears to have run afoul of his parishioners with his eccentric sermons, and his flock complained to the clerical powers that be in his native country. So he turns up in the U.S. in 1909, and he was assigned to St. John's Catholic Church in Louisville, Kentucky. He gets into some scrapes there and is soon transferred to St. Boniface in New York City. In 1912, at the chapel's rectory, he encounters a woman named, I hope I get the name right, Anna Amuller, a housekeeper. Again, what is it with maids and axes at this time? Maids, nannies, au pairs, whatever you want to call them, and axes. Supposedly voices in his head tell him that she's the one for him. The voices in her head tells her the opposite. But ultimately, they end up in a secret sexual affair. During the same time, he begins another tryst, this time with a man who was a dentist, here we go, dentist again, and a counterfeiter named Ernest Murray. So Father Hans and Anna were, quote, married in a ceremony that he himself ordained, but nobody else seemed to recognize. They supposedly do the nasty on the church's altar, where Hans tells her that God has ordered him to sacrifice her. Sorry. So it seems that kink quickly turns to terror, at least for Anna, and she runs away. Soon after this, he appears at the flat that the two shared in. What does he do? He slashes her throat, he rapes her corpse, drinks her blood, dismembers her, and tosses her remains into the Hudson River. Anna's corpse, or at least pieces of it, were soon recovered, and all eyes turned to Father Schmidt. He is arrested and he's jailed, and as expected, he claims insanity as his defense, which to me sounds like a pretty good idea. His lawyers testified that dozens of family members were known lunatics. So this is running in his family's bloodline. He implicates his other lover, Dr. Murray, as having been the actual murderer, which he claimed at trial happened during a botched abortion performed on Anna and her unborn child. All right, so this guy, Dr. Murray, is now, he's a dentist. He's supposedly a counterfeiter. He's an obstetrician. It gets weirder and weirder. The trial drags on until February 1916, when finally this maniac is strapped into the chair at Sing Sing. Following his death, many other reports circulated about the possible, even probable role of several other people, mostly children. But we'll move on to the next one before I throw up.
Who's this?
Ruth Snyder, maiden name Brown. So she's also a convicted murderess. How's that for an old school term? Executed at Sing Sing for the killing of her husband, Albert Snyder, this time in 1928. Ruth and her husband, 13 years her senior, were married from 1915 until 1927. She began an illicit affair during her unhappy marriage with a man named Henry Gray, who was a, quote, corset salesman in New Jersey. Now, how do I get a job as a corset salesman? So in what sounds like a Dateline episode, she and Henry conspire to murder Albert for insurance money. She seems more keen on this than him. Maybe corset sales not going so well, but several attempts are made until one finally succeeds. On March 27th of 1927, Ruth and Hank abduct Al, and they tie him up and they stuff his nose with chloroform rags and essentially beat him to death and do a terrible job as staging it as a burglary. Both Ruth and Henry are eventually arrested and predictably implicate each other. These accusations and defenses are in vain, and both are sentenced to the chair. On January 12th of 1928, both were electrocuted to death in the electric chair at Sing Sing, one after the other, she going first. What makes Ruth Snyder's execution most notable was the photograph that was widely published in newspapers at the time. It had been surreptitiously taken by a man called Tom Davis at the New York Daily News. He was a photographer, and he was using his own ankle device. And for you ghouls out there, it's easily found today on the web. it was widely debated, by the way, at the time, whether this photo of an actual execution, especially of a woman, would engender support or opposition to death by electrocution. And that remains an open question today. So next on the list is Albert Fish, and his ghoulish practices are well known to those that have an interest in this sort of macabre sort of thing. But as this show is not really about serial killers, it's about those that have been executed, he does fit into this picture, so we will talk about him and we will talk about his actual execution. And for starters, his name was not Albert, but rather Hamilton Howard Fish, but you can call him Al. I'm taking a guess here because I haven't found corroborating evidence to support this, but he was most likely named for another Hamilton Fish, who was a very prominent person in 19th century America, who was variously senator from New York and Secretary of State during the administration of Ulysses S. Grant, as well as many other important roles during that era. But our Albert was born in 1870 in Washington, D.C., and he was not a politician or public servant, but rather a sort of a public deviant, convicted rapist, murderer, and cannibal. And that is just for starters. His father was American and his mother was Scots-Irish, or Ulster Scots, as you prefer. And the elder Fish, as he truly was the elder Fish, was 43 years older than his mother. I'm sorry, when I say the elder Fish, I laugh. Mental illness was found in many strains of his family, and it was known that countless relatives had been institutionalized for this affliction. His father, considering his age, unsurprisingly died when Al was young, and his mother, unable to raise him, sent him to an orphanage. As we've seen with someone like Carl Panzram, who we've covered in detail on this podcast, Albert was brutalized in this orphanage, and from the age of 12 seems to have developed a relationship with a, quote, telegraph boy. And they engage in typical pubescent activities, quote, as drinking urine and, quote, eating feces. So if there are any G.G. Allin fans out there, you'll understand. So as he grows into young adulthood, he pimps himself out as a gigolo and by his own account begins abducting and raping young boys. His mother hastily orders an arranged marriage and eventually he sires several children while purporting to carry on a conventional life as a family man. But Al ain't really fooling nobody, and in 1903, now in his 30s, he's arrested for larceny and he's remanded to, once again, Sing Sing prison. While in prison, he seems to have indulged in what he's really all about, forcible sodomy and other experimentation with sadomasochism. After his release, years later in 1910, he abducts a young man of limited capacity, as it was called, in Delaware, and he sexually mutilates him. And remarking in his later journals that, quote, I shall never forget his screams or the look he gave me. And then he goes on to say that he kissed his victim goodbye and he gave him a $10 bill and he, quote, took the first train I could back home. So now we're going to fast forward a few years here. We're going to 1917. He's now 47 years old. And this is when his wife finally leaves him. Okay, let's stop here for a minute. Really? It took her this long to realize he might not be the right guy for her? So this is when his insanity intensifies, if that hasn't happened already, and he more regularly seems to self-mutilate. And all you need to know, if you choose to do a search for the widely distributed x-rays of his body, you'll see the results of this. It's very disturbing. He would also instruct his children to flail him with a spiked paddle of his own construction, and also admitted to inserting lighter fluid into various orifices and light himself on fire. All you freaky people out there, please take care and be careful. Because, I'm sorry, I don't care who you are, you're not going to outdo Albert Fish. So you be the judge. So during the 1920s, he's now in his 50s, he commits more and more heinous crimes. Wait, is that even possible? Yes, it is. Each more outrageous than the last, and most of them involved the most vulnerable, street urchins, etc., whom he believed were useless. In 1930, he was eventually arrested for the killing of Grace Budd, a 10-year-old girl, and evidence soon came to light of several other child murders committed by him. After lengthy investigation and the inevitable insanity defense, Fish was sentenced to death. None of the jurors doubted his insanity, but seeing as his crimes were so horrific, they voted unanimously to condemn him to death via electrocution. And this was carried out at Sing Sing on January 13th of 1936. As is widely known, on his way to the chair, Albert Fish handed a final statement to his defense attorney, a man named James Dempsey. And when asked by the press to read these remarks, Dempsey simply said, quote, "I will never show it to anyone. It was the most filthy string of obscenities that I have ever read." So as these various and sundry crimes come to light, he would also come to be known by all sorts of wild monikers, including, quote, the Moon Maniac, the Gray Man, the Boogeyman, and the Werewolf of Wisteria. But again, for the sake of this episode, we call him Al. The next person we'll talk about is the story of George Stinney, and it's tragic in many ways. And on this show, we sometimes share, quote, gallows humor. There's really nothing but sadness to find in this very short life and death of this boy. And he was a boy. He was born in October of 1929, and he was electrocuted in the electric chair at the South Carolina Penitentiary in Columbia in June of 1944. So let those dates sit in and resonate with you to think about the age that we're talking about here. He is known as the youngest person to be legally executed in the United States in the 20th century, and probably well before that. Though as we will discover in other episodes of this podcast, sadly, he's not the youngest person known to be executed. There are others that we will talk about. But for the sake of this episode and the 20th century, he does have that unfortunate memory. Tenney was a black kid born and raised in a very small town. We call it a town. It's in central South Carolina. So on this show, it's important that we're not interested in weighing in on the guilt or innocence of those whose stories we tell. But in this tragic story, evidence has come to light suggesting that this kid was innocent. I don't think any of us will ever know the truth. What we do know is that on March 23rd of 1944, two young girls turn up dead near Stinney's home. Both were beaten to death, and one was possibly raped, though that was never corroborated. Stinney and his brother John were arrested, and George confessed to the killing. John was released. His teacher, their teacher at the time, also happened to be a black man, testified against him, and he stood by his story many years later. And he's on the record as stating that he had witnessed some sort of a fight between George and the girls who were victimized in this crime. George was taken to jail in Columbia for fear of being lynched. He was swiftly convicted of the murders by an all-white jury, and he was sentenced to death. So we're talking about Jim Crow, South Carolina, but we're also talking about being implicated by someone of his own race. We don't try to adjudicate things. We're not lawyers. This is not what we do. We're trying to tell stories as we understand them. And it's important, I think, to keep that in mind, and I hope the audience respects that. There are some other strange things. It's noted that even his own father was said to admit that his son was culpable in this heinous crime. So on June 16th, 1944, at age 14, George Tenney was led to the death chamber, and reportedly a Bible was placed under him as he was this very diminutive 5'1". He was said to have sobbed continuously during his preparation to the afterlife, and when asked as if he had any last words, he simply said through his tears, "No, sir." Since his death, the Stinney case has been cited repeatedly in legal and political circles as well as mass media due to his age, I would say, and the Jim Crow laws that were firmly in place in the American South at that time. So it's a very tragic story, but it's worth noting as the youngest person that was known to be electrocuted in the United States or anywhere else. We'll now shift to John 𝐕𝐈𝐃𝐄𝐒. And John 𝐕𝐈𝐃𝐄𝐒 is noted for, he's noted for being the first person executed in the United States after the overturning of the Furman versus Georgia ruling in 1972, which temporarily halted executions in the U.S. for most of the 1970s. So a little bit about his past. He was born in Iowa. He was a career criminal, and he had been sentenced to hard time in California in 1972 for armed robbery. And it's suspected probably worse than that. He managed to escape, and he picks up a hitchhiker named Joe Simonowitz, and they're off to Florida, Tallahassee specifically. And what does he do then? John attacks Joe with an axe in a hotel room. Here comes the axe. I don't know about you, but I've spent many nights in hotel rooms, and of all types, 1 star, 5 stars. I've been to all of them. I've seen a lot of weird shit, but I can't claim to have ever seen anybody wielding an axe. But in this podcast, there's lots of wielding of axes and hatchets and all sorts of other things. 𝐕𝐈𝐃𝐄𝐒 accuses the unpronounceable Polish guy of robbery, sexual assault, and forced Russian roulette. Okay, forced Russian roulette. Now, think about this. I'm sorry, but I have to say it one more time. Forced Russian roulette. Though I appreciate this as an inventive defense, isn't forced Russian roulette tantamount to murder? Well, it seems the robbery, anal rape accusations, compulsory Russian roulette defense didn't work, and 𝐕𝐈𝐃𝐄𝐒 was sentenced and eventually became the first person executed after the brief reprieve of the death penalty. So he goes down in history as the first person executed since the resumption of the practice. He was electrocuted on May 25th, 1979, on the old Sparky at Stark in North Florida. For the record, I was a little kid living in Florida at the time, and I remember my classmates in elementary school flicked the lights when he was executed. And that is a true story. So we're going to just wrap this up with Nicholas Sutton. Nicholas Sutton, the reason we mention him, he's the most recent of those to die by state-sanctioned electrocution. And this took place at the Riverbend Prison in Tennessee, February 20th of 2020. Now, this person, Mr. Sutton, is notable not only just because it was so recent as of this recording, but also because he chose this method to lethal injection. And Tennessee is one of the very few states that allow the condemned a choice as to how they choose to die. He was a run-of-the-mill scumbag, basically, it seems, who was convicted of murders in North Carolina, Tennessee as far back as the late 70s, and spent much of his life incarcerated. In the mid-1980s, he killed a fellow inmate who was a known pedophile and child killer, and for this, he was sentenced to death. While in prison, he found God, and he fought his sentence for decades until Judgment Day arrived. There seems to be no doubt that he arrived at some sort of solace during his lengthy stay in the big house, but in the end, the salvation he sought came to a swift end by the electrodes applied to his body. Not after being administered a communion of grape juice and snack crackers, and of course, fried pork chops, mashed potatoes, and peach pie. His last words were, quote, "I'm just grateful to be a servant of God." We're going to list very few last words here for this podcast. And here's a few. John 𝐕𝐈𝐃𝐄𝐒, who we've already discussed. His last words were, quote, "Those without the capital get the punishment." Now, I frankly think, all right, a man named George, I just have to assume his name was Appel, but here's the joke. And this is like a bad dad joke, but I'm going to read this. A man named George Appel, He was electrocuted in 1928 after having killed a cop in New York, and he was reputed to have said, quote, "Well, gentlemen, you are about to see a baked apple." Or, depending on who you want to believe, he also may have said, quote, "All the ladies loved baked apples," followed by, quote, "Damn, no power outage?" All right, here's Jimmy Glass, killed in 1987. Final words, gone fishing. All right. David Sandifer, 2018, said from the chair, quote, "Beats being on death row." Edmund Zagorski remarked, quote, "Let's rock." Obviously, this guy loved AC/DC. Oh, there have been many more of these last mortal words on a future episode of this podcast called Famous Last Words, we will be talking about those, and so check that out.
This concludes the latest episode of Well Hung History. Run away and cry now, but before you do, make sure to subscribe and leave us a killer review. Find us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, and all the rest. New episodes drop regularly. Tom Payne Productions, all rights reserved and preserved.